okay still in the back? Okay. It'd be good if I didn't have any feedback. All right, it's truly a pleasure to be here. I was here, I guess the last one, I gave a couple talks, and this is one of my favorite talks to give, and it talks about putting together forages in a way that we can build a grazing system that will extend the number of days that we can graze per year. And this is really important, and I'll tell you why as we get into this. Just a little bit about myself. I'm actually from Northeast Ohio. I grew up on a small farm there. I went to the military after high school. Didn't know what I wanted to do, but 4 years in the Navy straightened me out. And I kind of missed the farm when I came back. And so I went to Ohio State, did a bachelor's and master's there, and went on to the University of Kentucky, where I actually did a landscape grazing study in Appalachia, looking at stocking rates for cow operations on land. So today I want to talk about building a year-round grazing system. And I always like to start out with Jim Garish. Jim did a great job this morning. And it basically says that to really manage a forage livestock system, you have to have a basic understanding of the soil, the plant, and the animal, and how those things interact together, and then how the management decisions that we make affects that interaction. And that's really, really important. We often like to take systems apart into pieces, but usually when we do that, they don't act the same when we put them back together. Everything has to be managed together, and how the weather impacts it, how your management decisions impact it, how your soil fertility impacts the production of that system. It's really important to understand how those pieces go together. When we talk about forage systems and sustainable forage systems, there's several characteristics I'd like to mention. And the first one is that they not only protect our natural resources, so our soil and our water, to build those natural resources over time. That's really important. And when we talk about grazing systems, they're probably one of the most sustainable agricultural systems that we have. If we can maintain a healthy and vigorous sod in that pasture, that's going to do more to protect our soil and our water resources than about anything else. It's all about harvesting rainfall. If we have a really good, well-maintained pasture sod, our goal should be to not let a drop of rain run off of our farm. It's got to be profitable. Things can't be sustainable unless they're profitable, and that's really, really important to remember. Sometimes I think we lose sight of that when we talk about conservation. Conservation is great in itself, but the system has to be profitable to be sustainable long term. And I hedge that a little bit. Sometimes we get to the point in our life that maybe profitability is not the most important thing. Maybe we've done well, we've made our money, and maybe it's a lifestyle choice for us. That happens sometimes, but even if it's a hobby, it's always a lot more fun if you make a little bit of money at your hobby. When we talk about profit ruminant livestock production systems, there's kind of three basic ways I look at how we can increase net return to the farm. The first one is to impact the price we get for our product. So we do that by doing things like group cattle sales, vaccinating our calves so we get a higher price for our calves in the stock market, weaning our calves, preconditioning our calves, direct marketing our products. Those are all ways to enhance the net return to the farm. The second one is to increase the amount of product that we produce. So that's just basic economics. If we produce a product which has a profit margin of this much, we produce more units of that project, increase net return. And that works to a point, but at some point you become limited with resources. You don't have enough land area. You don't have enough time to manage more land area further from the farm, and so on. And the last one, I think, is where we have the most potential to impact net return to the farm, and that's by controlling our production costs. And this is really, really important, because in a commodity-based market, which we are, even if we think we aren't, we are in a commodity-based business. The person that's usually the winner is the one that has the lowest production cost. And that's really, really important to keep in mind. And when we look at cow-calf budgets, the number one item in cow-calf budgets is hay and supplements. Number one by far. This is a budget from Virginia Tech. This is a fall calving herd on a hay ration. And as you can see, our winter feed cost makes up almost 2/3 of the total cost to produce that calf. I mean, it's huge. We have other things, you know, vet and mineral and replacement bull. Those are all small pieces of the pie. What's interesting is that when times get tight and the calf prices are low, people start to cut things, and they cut things that they write checks for. So maybe they skimp on a replacement bull, or maybe they don't call the vet when they should, or maybe their vaccination program isn't quite what it should be. All those things open you up to risk. What you really need to be focusing on is that big piece of the pie, that winter feed cost. And that's kind of what today's talk is about. How can we get more grazing days per year and reduce the cost of that winter feeding program? And Jim talked a little bit about cost of hay production. This is our Virginia Tech hay budget. And this is tall fescue hay, 3 tons per acre. We divide it up into variable and fixed costs. Our fixed costs include things like machinery. That's whether we make 1 bale of hay or 1,000 bales of hay, we've got to pay for that machinery. And that's what we call a fixed cost. Our variable costs tend to increase with our hay production. So that's things like diesel fuel and lube and twine and fertilizer. The more hay we produce, the higher those variable costs are going to be. The point I want to make is that when we really sit down, I think Jim had $120 per ton. I came up with $115 per ton. And this is going to vary from farm to farm. But hay's expensive to make. Really expensive. $115 may be low for some operations. If you have a relatively small hay acreage and new equipment, guess what? You're going to be a lot higher than $115 per ton. Most people don't know what hay costs them in their system or what it costs them to make. So I would challenge you, this is an interactive budget available online. Go home and take it and sit down and think about what your costs are for producing hay. You may be surprised. So let me throw a curveball at you. And I pulled this off of the Virginia Hay Clearinghouse. It's a service of our Department of Agriculture. If you have extra hay, you can post it on there and hopefully sell your extra hay. And I didn't cherry pick this. This is just from South Boston area, Southside Virginia. Mixed grass hay, 200 round bales, 1,200 pounds each. Maybe a little optimistic on weight. First and second cutting, good quality. What's good quality mean? You know, I don't know exactly. I've never seen anybody put on the Hay Clearinghouse, I've got a bunch of really crappy hay I want to sell. So you have to take that with a little grain of salt. Delivery, $35 a bale. So say it's lighter than 1,200 pounds. Say it's 2 bales per ton. That's $70. It costs us $110 to $120 to make that hay. That's an opportunity. You have to remember that you're getting more than just hay when you buy hay. You're bringing nutrients into your system. Every ton of hay is going to have about $60 to $70 worth of. You're bringing that into your system when you buy it. Now, some of you are sitting there saying, "Well, I'm bringing weeds in too," and that's certainly a possibility. And you have to consider that, and you have to think about where you're getting that hay from and what the quality of the hay is too that you're purchasing, and how heavy those hay bales are, because there's quite a bit of variation depending on the baler and size of the bale and how much they actually weigh. So one of the best things you can do when you purchase hay is weigh some of those bales to make sure you know what you're getting. This is a SPA analysis, a standardized performance analysis from beef cow herds in the Midwestern United States. It was published in the Animal Scientist number 100 out there. Still very applicable, and what I want to point out here is that this percentage number, this is how important this factor is in profitability of this cow-calf operation. The higher the number, the more important it is. So when they looked at profitability, they could have given 84% of the total variation in what reasons why farms are profitable or not profitable. What I want to point out is the feed cost. 57% of the profitability from farm to farm dependent on feed cost. That's very, very important to note, because you know what we like to talk about? We like to talk about how much our calves are gaining, how growthy they are, how big they are when we sell them. Look, calf weight, 5%. You know, we need to focus on these winter feed costs. It's really, really important in terms of the total profitability. This is a simple slide, and but I think it gets a very important point across, and that point is that the good Lord gave us some really efficient forage harvesters, and it's up to us to put them in a situation where they can harvest forage for themselves more days of the year. They replace equipment, they fertilize as they go along, they don't use much diesel fuel. Even my son last night when I was looking at my talk in the room pointed out, he said, "What's the deal with that slide?" I said, "Well, I took it when I first came to the research station. I thought diesel fuel price was real high." Yeah, it's amazing how things change. At that time, they said oil will never go over $60 a barrel. So, anyways, is that anything that we can do to help these guys harvest forage more days of the year is going to be a positive to our bottom line. So when we think about getting started with extended grazing, there's several things that have to be in place so that you can be successful. And the first one is you got to have the right attitude. Don't do it because I told you to do it. Don't do it because Ed Rayburn told you to do it, or your local soil and water guy told you to do it, or your neighbor. Do it because you want to do it. If you go into it with a bad attitude and you say, "Man, this is never going to work," chances of you being successful are really, really slim. You're going to have problems, and you're going to have floods and droughts, and if you have the right attitude, you're going to find your way around those problems. It's not a perfect system, for sure. I mean, we're dealing with climate, and like Jim talked about, we talk about averages, but we don't have average years. We have dry years and we have wet years, and that makes an average. My good friend Gordon Groover at Virginia Tech says an average is like putting 1 foot in a bucket of ice cold water, one in a bucket of scalding hot water. On average, you're pretty comfortable, but it hurts like hell. And that's exactly what an average is. So the second thing that has to be in place is controlled grazing. This is really, really important. If you don't have a rotational stocking system or a controlled grazing system or a management-intensive grazing, whatever you want to call it, in place so that you can manage livestock grazing, then chances of extending the grazing season are going to be pretty slim. Water's key. We really need to think about how we lay a water system out. We need to build flexibility into that water system. We're going to manage residual height that Jim talked about on day one at rest period. That's going to increase the productivity of those pastures. Also, the drought tolerance of those pastures. We're going to harvest more water, and the root system on those plants are going to be deeper, more well-developed, and more tolerant to intermittent drought stress. And when we do that, our pastures are going to grow longer into that drought and come out of that drought faster than our neighbors' pastures that have been continuously abused for years and years. We're going to build stronger nutrient cycles with controlled grazing. We're going to have better distribution of dung and urine within the grazing system. We're going to have the power to manage botanical composition. Grazing management is an extremely powerful tool. We can shift what species of forages are dominant within a pasture mixture just by how we manage that grazing. And Ozzy talked about that yesterday in her presentation. I really enjoyed Jim's presentation this morning, but you know, if you're just trying to get somebody started with rotational stocking, telling them they have to move animals twice a day, you know, and you got to have 75 paddocks, that's probably going to be a no-starter for them. Over the years, you know, I've kind of taken up a little bit different approach. I think if we can just get people to start to rotationally stock, it doesn't have to even be for big. You can just get them to take one pasture and put a temporary fence down the middle and divide it in half, then you've done something. And it will start to move from there. And as they start to see the benefits of rotational stocking, productivity and better drought tolerance, they're going to want to subdivide those pastures more. So just getting them started, remember that system has to not only fit the livestock and the forage production, but also what you want to do on your farm. You may not want to move animals twice a day. You may want to move them once a week because you work off the farm and you want to move them on Saturdays when you're home. That system has to not only fit forage production, but it has to fit you. And that's really important to consider. The other thing I stress when we think about grazing systems in extending grazing is building flexibility into that system. The worst thing you can do is go lay out a system and put in a bunch of permanent fence posts and fence. You want to build the most possible flexibility when you lay your water system out and your main fencing system out so that you can evolve with that grazing system, because it's an evolution. You learn, your pasture productivity increases as you start to manage those pastures better, and you'll want to do things differently. You'll figure out, well, maybe that fence isn't exactly in the right place. Well, if it's a temporary fence, it's real easy to move. If it's a bunch of 6-inch posts you drove in the ground with 5 strands of high tensile wire on it, it's much more difficult to move. Soil fertility is important, and Ed talked about this yesterday, but you've got to have a base level of soil fertility for pastures to be productive. I don't buy into this idea that we can make something out of nothing. You know, we have to have a certain level of base fertility there to start with. If we don't, then we're going to have a field of broom straw, essentially. So it's important to look at that medium plus to high minus range for soil fertility levels and a pH of above 6. And what we want to do is we want to create an environment that's going to encourage legume in that pasture stand for our cool season pastures. And that's going to be a little bit better fertility, and it's going to be a pH of 6 to 6.4. And remember, the beautiful thing about grazing systems are that a well-managed grazing system, animals are recycling 80 to 90% of the nutrients. They go in one end of the animal and out the other end. And it's up to us to manage that nutrient flow. With a well-managed, controlled grazing system, we're going to get better nutrient distribution within our pasture areas than we would with a continuously stocked system. Stocking rate that Jim talked about this morning is really, really important. If we don't have the proper stocking rate, extending grazing is going to be difficult, if not impossible. So getting that stocking rate right is really, really important. In my opinion, you're much better off to start on the lower end of the stocking rate than you are on the higher end. If you start in the lower end, you can add animals. If you start on that top end of the stocking rate and it's too high for your management skills, for the pasture productivity, for your soils for that year, you know, it's going to be a downward spiral. You're never going to be successful. So start a little bit lower and work your way up. In Virginia, you know, I like to see people start at 2.5 to 3 acres per cow-calf unit if they're really serious about extending the grazing season. You know, if you want to feed hay from November 1st to May 1st, then you can stock higher. But really, that's an expensive proposition. So let's talk about forage options that we can use in this part of the country. And the amazing thing about forages is there's so many different things that we can grow, and even some non-traditional crops that we can grow that can be used as forages. And it's up to us as grazers to think about that and think about how we fit everything together into a system that's going to help us extend grazing. So when we think about selecting forage species, some characteristics I always like to talk about, but number one on my list is that whatever you're growing has to be regionally adapted. Sounds silly, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen people move to the south side of Virginia from New York or Ohio or wherever, and they bring their forage species along with them. And sometimes those mistakes are really, really costly. We saw a grazing dairy come in the south side, and they brought perennial ryegrass down with them. No chance of it being successful in the south side of Virginia. And he asked me what forage species, and I told him tall fescue, novel endophyte would probably be his best forage base. Well, he decided on perennial ryegrass. That was a very, very expensive mistake. Lots of other things to look at, but distance and then adaptation to the soils on your farm. So just because a forage species is regionally adapted doesn't necessarily mean it's adapted to all the soils in your farm. A good example would be alfalfa. Forage species, very productive, very drought tolerant, very poorly adapted to wet soils. So you have to think about where you're trying to grow that forage on your farm and what soil types that you do have. So let's talk about some options. Generally, I like to separate things into warm and cool season species. And when we look at cool season grasses, they're going to have optimal photosynthesis in their leaf blade at around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's when it's going to have optimum photosynthesis. When we get above 70 degrees in that leaf blade, we tend to decrease the photosynthetic rate. And eventually in the summer months when it's really hot out and those nighttime temperatures are staying up around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, cool season grasses just are not growing, even if they have adequate moisture, because their growth is temperature limited. They tend to be more digestible and higher in crude protein, longer total growing season in this part of the country. And that's why cool season grasses should really be the base of a forage system here. Our warm season grasses don't have optimal photosynthesis until around 90 degrees Fahrenheit in that leaf blade. And they tend to be less digestible and lower in crude protein, more drought tolerant, and more efficient at using water. And you're saying, well, why do I care about water use efficiency? I'm not in an irrigated system. Even in a rain-fed system, warm season grasses are able to produce about 1.7 to 2 times the amount of dry matter during the summer months compared with the cool season grass, because they're able to grow during the summer months. Their growth is not temperature limited. So they can be a very effective way at making better use of water during the summer months. So in a pasture situation, a lot of times if we have crabgrass in our pasture, sometimes naturally occurring, it'll rain, it'll be dry, and it'll rain just a little bit. Not enough rain to stimulate our cool season grasses and really get them growing again, but that crabgrass will grow inches in just a short, very short period of time, within 3 or 4 days after it receives that summer thunder shower. Those warm season grasses are able to respond to that rainwater during the summer months. This is just a nice demonstration of a Bermuda grass on the right-hand side and a tall fescue, and this is in March at the research station. Bermuda grass is not dead, it's just dormant. It's a warm season grass. It's going to be productive from May until September. Primary months will be June, July, and August. And the tall fescues are cool season grass, so it's starting to grow right now in March. Then we got some alfalfa up here in this corner. That's a cool season legume, perennial legume. So these are the growth curves of commonly used forages. The top 3 are cool season grasses: orchard grass, bluegrass, fescue. Hump of growth in the spring, hump of growth in the fall. Not much going on in the summer months. Growth is temperature limited. On the bottom we have our warm season grasses. All that growth is packed right into the summer months. You can see how they may be beneficial having those in a forage system with those cool season grasses. They would supply forage when cool season grass is limited during the summer months. The first species I want to talk about is not a new one, but is by far our best adapted cool season grass. And people moan and complain about tall fescue and tall fescue toxicosis and so on, but we need to think about it as a blessing rather than a curse, and think about how we can work it into forage systems and help us extend our grazing season. And the focus really needs to be on management. Probably the most important thing that tall fescue can do to us is that it can be stockpiled for winter grazing. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. But this is our competitive advantage in this part of the country, is stockpiling for winter grazing. There's probably not a more inexpensive way in our part of the country to really overwinter cows than stockpile grass. And if you're not stockpiling, it really needs to be part of your forage system as you move forward. Tall fescue is not the only grass that we can stockpile for winter grazing. We can stockpile orchard grass and bluegrass, but by far it's best adapted to stockpiling, just because of the way it grows. In the fall, tall fescue growth decreases at a temperature that's slightly above photosynthesis. You're saying, well, why do I care about that? Well, photosynthesis is still going on even after growth slows, and that allows very high levels of sugars to accumulate in that plant. And those make stockpile from tall fescue very nutritional as it goes into the winter months. So stockpiling is simply allowing forage growth to accumulate, and we do this in this part, stockpiling in this part of the country usually in late summer. We allow forage to accumulate until late fall, early winter, and then we use it for deferred grazing. Best option for us to extend the grazing season. If you're not doing it, again, you should start to do it. We want to protect pastures that are going to be stockpiled, and what I mean is we don't want to use them during the summer months. We want to have adequate residual. We want to have a high carbohydrate status so that when the temperatures cool in the fall, if the rain comes, they're ready to grow. And this is just a diagram of a cool season grass growth. All stockpiling is taking this growth in the fall, saving it for deferred grazing during the winter months. And in some years we can graze into January, some years into February, and some people in the south side of Virginia actually graze pretty close to 365 days a year. So it can be done. This is some stockpile grass. This is not from Virginia. This is actually from northeast Ohio. This is on my dad's farm in Alliance, Ohio, outside of Alliance, Ohio. And this is December 25th. This is a little closer to home in Virginia. This is by the stockyards in Blackstone. Really good neighbors here. Husband and wife, very, very good at grazing management. This is February 10th, 16% crude protein, 60% TDN. Easily meet the requirements of a brood cow that's lactating, fall calving brood cow. One of the big advantages of stockpile grass is it's almost always higher in forage quality than most of the hay that we make in south side of Virginia. You guys probably make better hay in West Virginia than we do in south side. But there's a lot of poorly managed hay acreage and maybe that's saying something about the job I'm doing, I don't know. But we make a lot of very mature hay in south side of Virginia, and a lot of times we're looking at crude protein of 10% or less and TDN in the lower 50s. We always get excited when it snows in south side because we don't get that much snow, and we want to haul a bunch of hay out there, but cows are really pretty adaptive, and if there's grass underneath that snow, they usually find it, and these cows are flipping up pieces of icy snow to get to the grass underneath that snow. How we manage that stockpile is going to impact how many grazing days we get per acre. And Jim talked about temporal utilization. That's really what we're talking about here this morning. If we have mixtures of clover and fescue, which we should strive to have in our pastures, the more clover, that's the pastures that you want to use first, because the clover tends to deteriorate during the winter months much faster than the stockpile tall fescue. So use those first, and then strip graze. Strip grazing is an important tool for utilizing tall fescue. If we look at two things that it does, it maximizes utilization and it improves forage quality or maintains forage quality. And so let's look at the first one. If we give animals access to this whole pasture, we let them in the gate, where are they going to go? They're going to go all the way to the other end of the pasture. They're going to walk across all that forage, and they're going to waste a lot of forage. What we want to do is just give them access for enough, ideally for 2 or 3 days, and then we move the fence back. We start at the water source. No back fence needed for grazing stockpile because it's not actively regrowing. And that's going to improve utilization very, very much. You know, you'll be getting 60 to 70% utilization. You can never get 100% utilization, but 60 or 70% is pretty good to get that much forage actually in the stomach of the animal. If we grazed it continuously, or we just opened that gate up and let those animals in there, we'd probably be closer to 35%, maybe a little bit lower. So we can get more grazing days per acre by simply strip grazing that pasture. It's like free winter feed. Okay. The other thing it does is that it maintains quality of that stockpile better. It's not magic, but what happens if we turn those animals into this one big boundary is that they go out and they graze. And what are they going to eat? They're going to eat the best stuff in there, right? Anything that's green, they're going to go and pick around and choose that. And then all of a sudden there's dry matter still there, but guess what? It's a bunch of dead brown material. When we strip graze, we're rationing that forage out. We're saying, now you don't get to choose, you got to eat both the good and the bad. So that's going to maintain quality of that stockpile at a more level plane as we get into the winter months. So let's look at what it costs to feed hay real quick and what it costs to feed stockpile. So I made some assumptions here. I said $100 a ton because you got some used equipment, and
you don't let animals.
Everybody always says, "Well, I work for free," but really, if we feed hay or we graze stockpiles, it costs us something in time, in equipment, and so on. So I say $20 a ton feeding costs, 20% storage and feeding loss for hay. Probably pretty conservative. I think it could be higher than that. So I figured we get about 53 feeding days per ton of hay. So if we just do the math, it costs us $120 total cost for the hay and the feeding. Divide by 53 days, that's about $2.25 a day. That's pretty close to what Jim talked about yesterday. But I throw one more thing in there, because most of the hay that we're going to buy or make is not going to meet the nutritional requirements of lactating fall calving cows. So I sat down with my animal scientist, and he came up with a little bit of corn gluten feed in there to kind of balance that out a little bit. And that's going to cost us another 75 cents. So we're looking at about $3 a day to feed hay with a little bit of supplement to get it up to the proper nutritional level. So let's do the same thing for stockpile. So I figured 2,500 pounds of dry matter per acre for stockpile. That could be low. It could be that in below average rainfall year. Sometimes it'll be a lot more than that. But this is the conservative estimate. I said that it costs us about $52 per ton of dry matter produced for stockpiling. So that's some nitrogen that we put on, $45, and then some feeding costs, $20. So I'm giving something for going out there and moving that temporary fence. Is it more or less work to move that temporary fence than feeding hay? He says less. I don't know if it's less, but it's a different kind of work. You know, I don't know if anybody's ever started up a diesel tractor in the dead of winter, but unless you have a new tractor, I mean, it can be a little bit of a pain. And then it's wet and it's muddy, and it's not a lot of fun to feed hay in the wintertime. And it's dark, usually. So it's a different kind of work for sure. I'm not sure if it's less or more. And I use a utilization rate of 70%, and when I did crunched all the numbers, I came up with 70 grazing days per acre. So if you take that $65, divide it by 70 grazing days, 90 cents a day to feed a brood cow during the winter months with stockpile versus $3 for hay. Just think about that for a little bit. Even if you could extend your grazing season 30 days or 60 days, that's going to make it's going to be a pretty big deal per cow. The last thing I wanted to mention, and I'm going to quit talking about tall fescue, I promise. But the latest chapter in this whole tall fescue saga is the development of the novel endophyte or friendly endophyte tall fescue. I think everybody in here is familiar with the toxic endophyte in tall fescue, and that causes reduced animal performance. And the latest chapter is they've discovered an endophyte that gives that plant resistance to stresses, but doesn't produce the toxins associated with poor animal performance. And that's a pretty big deal. And I'll show you why. If you look down here, this max Q, which is compared to the toxic endophyte, endophyte free, and the novel endophyte, they gained almost 8 more a pound per day. That's a big deal. So the question is persistence of max Q, and it's good, but it has to be managed under controlled grazing. And the reason why is the animals don't get any negative feedback in the the summer months. So if you're grazing Kentucky 31 with a toxic endophyte, those animals don't feel good in the summer. They get a fever, they don't eat as much, they lounge around in the water more, they hang out underneath the trees. So that's kind of a negative feedback from that fescue. That doesn't happen with the maxcue because they don't get sick. And that means what? That means they eat more of it. So you have to manage grazing with novel endophytes. I think if you don't have a controlled grazing system, then this is a non-starter for incorporating the novel endophyte. We tested some novel endophytes under clipping, not grazing but clipping, and those are pointed out here: Texoma, Jessup. These are from Pennington. This is the newest Pennington product. Did very well in our trials in Southside. Bar Optima did less well. It's a little bit without head in there. I'm not sure why, but those stands never looked quite as good as the Pennington product. And then there's a couple more coming on the market. Duramax and Estancia are going to be coming on the market too. So now you've got about 5 or 6 novel endophyte varieties to choose from. Hopefully that'll make the prices a little more competitive because it has been pretty pricey for the seed. All right, this just talks about some considerations for replacing toxic stands of tall fescue. And infection level, certainly one of those. Rented farms, you know, it's going to be really hard to replace a stand of fescue on a rented farm unless you have a long-term lease on that. There's a lot of land in Virginia and West Virginia that we just don't want to try to replace tall fescue on. I mean, it's kind of holding the hillside together, and from a conservation standpoint, it just doesn't make sense to try to kill it and replace it in most cases. And then we have livestock class, cow-calf, versus something that really needs an endophyte, novel endophyte product like a dairy animal or a stocker calf that's really grown well. And then we have grazing management. Again, I said it has to really be under controlled grazing to be persistent. Okay, I want to change gears a little bit and talk a little bit about annual forages and how they can kind of fit into a forage system. And I'll give you my take on annuals in a minute, but they're important parts of forage systems because they can supply forage during deficit periods of the year. So there's always gaps in the grazing system when you don't have any forage. And these summer and winter annuals can fit into those gaps and help fill in those times of the year when you need a little forage. Lots of advantages. Are fast germinating, generally very good in forage variety, pretty productive. And then I put down flexibility of utilization because these annuals can be used for hay, they can be used for baleage, they can be used for grazing, depending on what you need in that particular year. If you have a really good year and your cool seasons are still productive in the summertime, you've got some summer annuals, you might consider just putting those summer annuals into a baleage for the winter months. Disadvantage is you establish them every year, and whenever you have to establish something every year, there's a risk of stand failure. It's going to rain too much, it's not going to rain at all. Then you have an annual cost. Now, in a year where they're productive, those annual costs are more than recouped in grazing. But in a year where they may not be as productive due to a drought, stress, then you're still on the line for those annual costs. Okay. So this is kind of my take on annuals in grazing systems. I think that a profitable grazing system is going to be based on well-adapted perennial sods that are supplemented with annuals. And I think that makes sense. And for us, you know, in Virginia and West Virginia, we need to really look towards fescue and mixtures of fescue and orchard grass and bluegrass and clover as our forage base. And working these annuals into a system where they will supply some summer or winter forage during those deficit periods. We can also use annuals as a tool for renovating pastures. So say we have a fescue pasture that we want to get into a novel endophyte tall fescue. Well, we can grow annual, winter annual and a summer annual there, and then come back and seed in the fall into that pasture, and that gives us time to eliminate that Kentucky 31 from that pasture and set up a situation where we can establish a novel endophyte tall fescue. Or if we want to renovate pastures or hay fields, annuals can fit real well into that type of system. a little work we started to do a number of years ago at the research station, and we've been testing summer annuals at the station since the early 2000s, but it wasn't till 2009 that we really started to look at digestibility. And these weren't all, we had about 30 varieties in the trial this year, and I could have put all 30 up there, but then you couldn't have read anything. So I took 2 of the highest ones, 2 of the bottom performers, and 2 in the middle. And there are different forage species. We have forage sorghum, sorghum Sudan grass, and pearl millet in this. And then some of them had the BMR trait. That's a brown midrib trait. It's a naturally occurring mutation in that plant that causes that midrib of the leaf to look a tannish or a brown color. And that's associated with lower lignin levels in that plant. And lignin is a component in the plant dry matter that causes it to be less digestible in the rumen of the animal. So the lower the lignin levels, generally the higher the digestibility is going to be in that plant. So anyway, when did 2009, and I got the yields back, and it's big range in yields, 3,800 pounds up to 6,800 pounds in yield. In vitro, true digestibility back, and that's where they take that forage material and they stick it in rumen fluid from the animal, and they measure what the microorganisms cause to disappear or digest. And they actually get rumen fluid out of an animal. They got a big rubber plug in the side, and they put a container in there and get it out of the animal, and then let it digest. So huge variation in digestibility, 54 to 74% range in digestibility, 20% range in digestibility. So when I saw those numbers come back, I said certainly the varieties that yielded the most were going to be the most mature, most dry matter, and they're going to be the least digestible. And then we started to match those numbers up.
They're powerful.
Well, the ones in the trial were also digestible ones in the trial. So that kind of got me interested in this relationship between yield and digestibility. And I tried to figure out a way to express that so people could see that. And I came up, let me just explain what it is. So we have we've got yield on the bottom, and this is actually indexed against the average yield for the trial. So 0 on this graph would be the average yield for that trial. We did the same thing with digestibility, index against average. So any of those have my species in this trial. And then we divided this graph up into 4 places, 4 quantities. So varieties that are down here in the lower left-hand corner.
Yeah, so
below average in yield and below average in digestibility. Those are varieties that you really don't want to put into your forage program if you don't have to. Now varieties over here in this corner are the ones that are above average in yield and above average in digestibility. Those are ones you want to look towards thinking about incorporating into your forage program. Now I just wanted to show you the impact of the brown midrib trait. So averaged over all the brown midrib varieties and all the conventional varieties in the trial, we had about a 4 or 5% increase in digestibility by just selecting a bag of seed that said BMR on it. Now sometimes they were much more digestible. The range in digestibility even within the BMR was pretty high. And same thing with the non-BMRs. So just buying a BMR seed doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the most digestible sorghum species. So you really need to ask your seed supplier, I'd like to see some digestibility data for that and see how it ranks against other varieties in that particular trial. So what we did was we looked at how these varieties performed over multiple years. This was 2 years of data, 2009 and 2010. We had 5 varieties that performed above average in yield and above average in digestibility for 2 years in a row. When we looked at 3 years of data, we had 3 varieties that performed above average in yield and above average in digestibility for 3 years in a row. That means they're fairly robust varieties under the conditions we tested them in Blackstone. And they were 2 products from Advanta and 1 product from Southern States. So these might be good to look at in West Virginia and maybe if you want to incorporate a BMR species grazing system. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit of data that's kind of outside the box, and the reason I'm showing you this is I want you to think about doing things that maybe are a little bit out of the norm. It's okay to be different. It's okay if your neighbors make a little bit of fun of you. You have to think about what you do, but it's okay to be thinking on the edge of the box. So we got standing corn here, and this was taken a number of years ago. Actually, Alex, stand up once. That's Alexander in that picture there. And this was over Christmas in Northeast Ohio when we were visiting my dad, and he got wet and he wasn't able to harvest all of his corn. And so we're standing out there in the cornfield looking at it, and the question is, what do we do with that? Do we harvest it and put it in the corn crib and then take it back out, and we take it to the feed mill and grind it, and then we haul that feed back to the cattle that we're finishing? Or do we graze it? Well, I know what my dad did. He harvested it, after it froze up, because you never listen to your son, of course. But that kind of got me interested in this idea of, can we graze standing corn? And that's really thinking a little bit outside of the box, especially when corn's $6. But it wasn't $6 at this point in time. This is what the standing corn looked like in March, and it actually had pretty good standability over the months. We had two types of corn. We had a grazing type from Baldridge Seeds, and then we had just a good solid Pioneer hybrid in the trial. And we had forage sorghum in there too.
That privet was terrible.
Sterile hybrid that just kept growing and growing and growing, and it didn't have any seed on it, and it was all stem.
Side of the fence.
Which quality we'll show you in a minute. Was by far the highest yielding, but pretty low in quality. It was all stalks by the time we got into March. Our corn actually held up pretty well through the winter months. We had somewhere around 10,000 pounds of dry matter produced per acre with standing corn. It's probably about 110 bushel corn. And looked at forage quality. This is total digestible estimate of endophyte. Dotted lines,
20 plus.
Lactating cow, a growing steer, and the dry cow. And this is the whole plant TDN. So plant TDN, that means all the way from the stalk to the top of the plant, including the ear. We ground up and tested the TDN. Now, an animal wouldn't eat the whole plant. Most likely it's going to start with the ear and then the leaves and the top of the stalk and work its way down and leave a lot of the lower stalk, most likely. But very good total digestible nutrients. Good source of energy. We're up over 60%, 65% TDN. It's protein.
Ragweed, all livestock.
6%, 7% crude protein. So that would have to be supplemented if we're going to use standing corn for grazing in most cases. So let me take you through just a little bit of economics on this, and I called it agroeconomics because I'm an agronomist and I'm doing economics, so don't put too much faith in my economics. If Greg Halleck was in here, he'd probably skin me alive because I forgot so much stuff in my analysis. But this is just meant to get you starting to think about this. So we made like a good economist, I make assumptions, of course.
Yes.
Pounds of dry per acre, that's our research data.
All right, so there's the ragweed.
On stocker calves of 15 pounds per day, and that's probably more than they're actually going to eat. Maybe they'll eat that later as they grow. And that's going to be broken up between corn and alfalfa hay because we're low in crude protein. We're going to need to feed a protein source. Probably one of the easiest to feed would be a decent quality alfalfa hay. We set a utilization rate of 65%. We could probably push that up a little bit. We're going to strip graze that corn. We're not going to give them access to the whole field. We're going to have a utilization cost of $20 per acre. Production cost of that corn from our Virginia Tech budget's around $325 to $350 an acre. That's pre-harvest cost. So luckily in this system, we don't have to buy a $200,000 combine. We're going to use our animals to harvest that corn. Average daily gain in the calves is 1.5 pounds a day. That may be low, but I wanted it to be conservative. And then a price per pound of calf of $1.60. And hopefully that took into account the little bit of slide you're going to get as those calves get bigger. So I'm not an economist, and I'll just go on record saying that one more time. So when I figured out how many grazing days we'll get per acre of corn, so 10,000 pounds of dry matter, we multiply it by utilization rate of 65%, then divide it by 8 pounds per day, because that's what we're going to feed in this corn alfalfa ration. And we get 810 grazing days per acre. Pretty crazy numbers. And the cost per grazing day for the corn. So we take our total cost, $345, we divide it by that 810 grazing days per acre, and then we add, that gives us our cost, production cost per day on corn, and we add in 65 cents for alfalfa hay per day, and we come up with about $1.05 a day. Pretty cheap winter feed, really. So, our projected return,
I don't recommend that unless
times $1.50, I mean 1.5 pounds of growth per day on those calves, times $1.60, minus our total production cost. Our total production costs were calculated by taking 810 times $1.05 per day. Now I don't have hauling and vaccinations and mineral in there. There's lots of other little things that go in there. But the point I want to make is that the return per acre here was $1,000. Did return from 420 corn, $54 an acre from our Virginia Tech budget. It's pretty amazing stuff when you start thinking outside the box and what you can do to extend grazing and what the opportunities that are that Jim was talking about. It's pretty amazing. So, crabgrass, I may get thrown out of the wonderful state of West Virginia for talking about crabgrass, but this is a component of pastures in the south side of Virginia that's really important. If it wasn't for crabgrass and wiregrass, which we also call Bermuda grass, we'd have a lot of hungry cows during the summer months. Crabgrass is well adapted to this whole mid-Atlantic region. It acts like a perennial through prolific reseeding. You can double crop it with winter annuals, and that's really probably how it should be grown. Good yield potential, excellent forage quality, much higher than Bermuda grass, which is probably not well adapted here. No prussic acid. It can accumulate nitrates under very, very high nitrogen fertilization. Believe it or not, that's crabgrass in my plots at the research station, 60 days after seeding. Pretty amazing. I mean, we had good growing conditions in 2001, but the crabgrass that you buy seed for would be Red River or Quick and Big, and that's an improved crabgrass that's been selected for more upright growth and more dry matter production. And it's really pretty amazing. Crabgrass does respond to fertilization, so as nitrogen fertilization increases, yield increases. Maximum yield at 305 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Never put 305 pounds of nitrogen per acre on crabgrass. This was a research study. You want to be down here in this straight area, and that's going to be somewhere in that 80 to 100 pound range of the curve. Where crabgrass really excels is forage quality. Very digestible, 70% in some of our in vitro work. The protein ranges from 6 to 14%. As it's going dormant in September, it's going to be low. It's going to be 6 or 7%. In mid-season, when it's actively growing and well fertilized, it's going to be up around 10 to 14% in brood protein. Really good work that for the Noble Foundation. And on medium quality crabgrass, he was gaining more than a pound and 3/4 a day on stocker calves without supplementation. So it's pretty amazing forage quality. If you have a finishing system or you want to make a weaning system for calves, you know, crabgrass may fit really well into that. Small grains, of course, you can grow small grains here, and they have a lot of advantages, and there's a number that we can use and incorporate into grazing systems here. Some require better fertility, and some require less fertility. But the point is that it's just another tool that you can use to fill those gaps in during the grazing season. And if you want to get fall grazing or some late fall, early winter grazing, you need to plant early with small grains, and you need to plant at a rate of 2 to 3 bushels per acre. And you want to make sure before you start to graze them in the fall that they're well anchored. In the the best way to do that is let it get up to about 8 inches and then grab a handful of it and give it a yank, just like a cow would when she's pulling forage off. And if you pull the roots out, you need to wait a little bit longer. So and then graze down to 2 to 3 inches. So you don't want to graze it down to the ground. You want to leave a little bit of residual on it, of course, and then let it grow up to 6 to 8 inches before regrazing. And then if you want to make hay off of it in the spring or harvest for a small grain, then you have to remove those animals before they raise the growing point off of that small grain. And that's when that plant starts to joint and that seed head starts to move up through the stem. Now, if we're making small grain for conserved forages, there's kind of 2 routes you can think about. We have on the bottom here a nice graph of small grains, different small grain yields over the years at the soft dough stage. And soft dough is when those seeds are actually in a doughy stage. And we can direct cut that and put it into a silo, and that's usually what happens. The yields are higher, but the forage quality is much lower at this part of the stage. For most grazing operations, if we're going to make hay or haylage out of it, or baleage, we probably want to harvest somewhere at the boot to early head stage. And when we do that, the forage quality is going to be much higher. The yield will be lower, but forage quality will be higher. We're going to have to wilt it, and if we're making baleage, and baleage or silage are really the best way to get a timely harvest. Sometimes it can be hard to get small grains cured in the spring for dry hay, but baleage, it allows you to cut on time, so you get it at the right maturity and put up a really high quality forage. Remember, baleage is not a miracle thing that's going to take bad quality forage and make it into good quality forage. It's just another tool. If we put bad quality forage into that bale and then wrap it with plastic, it doesn't magically turn into good quality forage. So stage of maturity is the #1 factor affecting forage quality. Keep that in mind as you move forward. And we're going to finish up and just talk a little bit about so we've done multiple trials for multiple years at the research stage. You can just
idea what I've got wrong.
Grass is so lush in the spring, provides a very high quality feed source, and it's very good for lactating or growing animals. Dairy or finishing animals would be a perfect fit for annual ryegrass within the system. Even if you wanted to make baleage out of this, if you're making baleage for beef cattle, you probably want to let it get a little bit more mature. It's going to draw the quality down to kind of match that quality up a little bit better with what the brood cow actually needs. If you're making baleage for a very high quality or a lactating dairy animal, you may want to cut a little bit earlier. So we actually have a dairy outside of the research station who lost their alfalfa stands in 2003. And 2002 was the driest year on record at Blackstone at the research station. At one point, we were 18 inches behind our rainfall. And then came 2003, we were at 90 inches, or almost double our rainfall that following year. So on average, we were doing pretty good, but that wet year killed a lot of alfalfa stands in the south side of Virginia because they would be cut and then water. So that dairy came back with annual ryegrass that year, and they've never looked back. Every year they plant annual ryegrass or small grain. They make silage in the spring, and then double crop it with a corn. So again, high quality, excellent yield. Does require some fertility, some nitrogen fertilization to be the most productive. We can overfeed or double crop with other warm season annual grasses in a system. And this has been the production of 3 of the varieties that we've had in the trial over the years. Pretty consistent production. So, somewhere around 7,500 to 8,000 pounds of dry matter year in and year out. I just want to kind of finish up with this slide, and I know my time's up, about putting all these things together into a system. And as Jim said this morning, the holy grail of grazing is year-round grazing. We won't reach out in many years, but some years we're going to really be able to extend that grazing season. And this is a potential system for the Appalachian region. We start out with our tall fescue base, and remember, cool season grass growth in the summer are often limited by temperature. First thing we can do extend grazing is going to be simply to better utilize that fescue in the system. And that's by stockpiling. That's our competitive advantage here, to lower those winter feed costs. We can come in and maybe use a warm season grass within our grazing system. It could be a Sudan grass or a sorghum Sudan grass. It could be crabgrass. It could be a pearl millet. It doesn't really matter. Something to fill in during the summer months. It could be a native warm season grass species. Then we'll come in and we'll double crop with our sorghum Sudan or Sudan grass with a cereal rye, or a mixture of cereal rye and ryegrass or annual clover, and come in and we'll fill in those last remaining gaps. Now look, I don't live in a fantasy world. It's a heck of a lot easier to stand up here and do this on paper than it is in the real world. But the point I want you to take home today is that you've got a tremendous amount of tools in your grazing toolbox. And it's up to you to get those out and figure out how they kind of fit together into a system. And it's going to involve fertility, it's going to involve grazing management, and it's going to involve choosing forage species in your grazing system. So with that, I'm finished. Is there any questions I can answer? That's the million-dollar question. So the question was residual on stockpile tall fescue. We graze ours pretty close, and generally we leave about 30% on a dry matter basis, probably behind on our stockpiles. We get about 70% temporal utilization. Usually it's a little deceiving when you actually get down and measure it, because it looks like there's less than 30% there, but when you actually measure it, it's about 30% dry matter left. But it's pretty close. I would say maybe 1 to 2 inches maybe. And there's a couple different ways you can look at that. Some people like to leave a little bit more residual on their stockpile, and I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, to leave a little bit of residual there. The other way to look at it is that you're setting yourself up. If you're frost-eating clover into your pastures, you set yourself up to frost-eat clover into that area that was stockpiled. You can kind of rotate around the farm where you stockpile at. You'll stockpile your strongest stands of fescue, graze them down tight, and then broadcast some clover onto them to get the clover back in the stand. All right, thank you. I'll be around the rest of the week.